10 years ago in 2014, I was using the Sony A6000 and their 7200mm f4 G lens, shooting SEC football games, and ultimately only using that camera and Sony lenses from the wide to 200mm. I was used to being the only person at big games packed with shooters to be using Sony cameras. People would look at me and what I had on my shoulder and look at me like I was nuts, because there was no long glass yet. I was still shooting Canon bodies and long lenses for sports. I had already switched entirely to Sony for all my video production needs, but the sports photography was still a mixed bag. When I was shooting the A6000, I didn't know how it was accomplishing autofocus in difficult sporting situations, but I knew it was making pictures that I likely would have missed with the Big II. To be honest, I think I shot Sony for the first 2 years without really understanding how facial recognition worked. When someone finally showed me how to enable IAF, I was stunned. Since that time, I've rarely had anything but perfectly sharp frames when editing my portrait shoots, with the eyes nailed. On the video side of things, the original A7S still wows filmmakers and still photographers alike when they find themselves shooting in near darkness. The sensor in the A7S is still used today in the A7S III, the FX3, and even the FX6 cameras. Many of the shows and movies you watch are shot on the same sensor. The original A7S was launched 10 years ago in April of 2014, and not one competitor has bettered its performance in the low light yet. Just 3 years after 2014, the A9 dropped and stunned the world. In my first 15 minutes with that camera, I realized that the DSLR was completely dead. In that moment, I knew that my own trajectory was with and through Sony for the future. Then in September of 2018, just a year later, the 400mm f2.8 GM made its arrival. When you use the A9 in tandem with a 400 GM, all I can say is magic happened. A year after that, the A9II arrived and bettered its counterpart with improved low light and anti-flicker on board, as well as a host of other features. A year later in 2019, the Sony FE 600mm f4 GM was unleashed and all bets were off. It was offered at the same time as the 200-600 G lens, which offered a sealed internal and zoom for just $2,000. For those that couldn't justify the cost of the 600 GM at $13,000, the 2-6 has become a fast favorite for all golf shooters as well as field sports, photojournalists, and nature and wildlife photographers. Birders absolutely love it. All along during this time, Sony's people were saying quietly that they wanted to be #1 pro camera maker in the world and knock Canon off its pedestal. Those of us that early ambassadors smiled and nodded politely to the Japanese and wondered if they had any idea what kind of battle they were in for. When the A1 launched in January of 2021, even those of us that were used to being wowed by Sony's engineers and their clever improvements were unprepared for that presser. 50 megapixel, 30 frames per second, great in low light, and 1/400th sync with Arena strobes, and anti-flicker that worked at the highest frame rate at 30 FPS. It was like truly a science fiction in our hands had arrived. The A1 was clearly the greatest mirrorless camera ever made at that moment. The specs seemed outlandish and unrealistic, but once you got to shoot with one, you were all in. Fast forward to this year, when the A9III showed up. Global shutter was something that was only real in motion picture industry, and from the skunkworks at Red and Arri. But all of a sudden, an almost 25 megapixel camera was announced that was the ultimate band-aid for every issue with electronic shutters that had come before. Even though Sony had already slayed the dragon of anti-flicker with the A1, banding was still a big problem if you shot in places that had lights that produced the issue. Now banding had been banished as well. 120 frames per second full-frame RAW files with no banding or flicker was now a thing. And on top of that, the camera was amazing in low light. It offered zero rolling shutter for both stills and video shooters. The A9III, I think, stunned the industry to its foundation when it dropped last spring. How do you compete with that? The 300mm 2.8 GM lens is a masterpiece and is likely the fastest AF lens Sony makes over 200mm right now. Paired with either the A9 or soon with the A9II, the combos will take no prisoners in terms of speed and accuracy and the sheer attack of the initial acquirer of the autofocus. Last week I had the pleasure of shooting with the A1 Mark II in New York City at the launch. And then I got to take one home so I could shoot an SEC game with it. Many people complain about the A1 Mark II not being advanced enough versus the A1. They're saying that it's not worth the upgrade. I don't think that's quite true. The worst thing that happened to the A1 Mark II took place last spring when the A9III launched. To have a new camera come out after the A9III was always going to be a problem. I believe that the A1 Mark II to be the best overall sports camera ever made, including the A9III. While the A9III has the global shutter at 120 frames per second, it's still only 24.7 megapixels. I have yet to shoot my two A9III bodies at frame rates faster than 30 frames per second. 30 frames per second is simply plenty fast for the sports I shoot. If I was at the Olympics, I might opt for the A9III over the A1 to go faster, but honestly, I often shoot at 20 frames per second, depending on the sport. When you compare what the A1 Mark II sensor offers photographers versus the A9III, it's hands down a better choice. You can literally crop the snot out of any frame and it will work and hold up no matter what you do in the crop. While there are shooters out there for whom the A9III is absolutely the only option, they are few and far between. You'd have to be shooting on strobes in the NBA or NHL a couple nights a week to justify that camera that can shoot at any shutter speed with each pop. Or maybe if you shoot an arena that has horrific banding issues from TV lights or the LED signage that now surrounds in some entire fields and arenas, you might be able to justify the A9III. But for everyone else that doesn't shoot on strobes or under weird lighting all the time, the A1 Mark II makes more sense. It also allows you to get more out of shorter glass by punching in, zooming on the sensor, to get the higher action tighter, and using all the real estate of the sensor to do so. Even if you shoot on strobes, the 1/4 sync is an industry best from any shutter other than the A9III, which actually has no shutter. The fact that the A1 Mark II can and will be used for landscape work, serious architecture photography, portraits, wedding, event, photojournalism, and for any use where large files are so needed, 50 megapixel is a massive file and more than enough for even advertising and industrial photography. That you can now turn on pre-capture on the A1 Mark II and look into the past for the frames that you would have formerly missed or is just an added bonus. Even in the modern medium format cameras from competitors don't compete with the A1's smaller file size when it comes to capturing action. No medium format has the ice-cold lock-on autofocus that will track and follow a running back through traffic or offer a ballet company's marketing director 200 frames of one leap of their prima ballerina on stage. Sony discourages me from saying anything negative about competing brands, but look at the cost of the R1 versus the A1 Mark II and what you get. The R1 cost is exactly in between the cost of the A9III and the A1 Mark II, but without 50 megapixels or a global shutter. I digress. I started this piece thinking back on the last 10 years of shooting along with Sony's ever-evolving technology. They are and have been my silent partner, and they help me in every shoot I do for a client. To this day, in 10 years and having been through literally every camera they've made to date, I have yet to have a single camera repair. When I need help with a loan, I'm on a first-name basis with my Sony Pro rep in Kentucky. This is not because I have a YouTube channel or that I'm an ambassador. The Pro reps know their business and they know their people in their area. They are focused primarily on customer service and tech support. Looking back, I'm proud to have been an early adopter as a pro shooter back in 2013. My first Sony was purchased off eBay for $350. It was the A3000, which even Sony would like to forget. The EVF was so bad you had to use focus peaking on the back screen to get sharp focus. But the images from that camera took my breath away. There was all this dynamic range and tone in the highlights. I was hooked on that little APS sensor way back then, and to this day, Sony continues to wow me. At this juncture, Sony is the official camera of the NFL, the Associated Press, and the Gannett chain of newspapers. I can't describe to you how long a journey Sony has made since the A3000 to the A1 Mark II.